On the morning of February 25th, 1986, inside the Malacañang Palace in Manila, the First Lady of the Philippines stood in her bedroom, surrounded by chaos. Imelda Marcos was 56 years old. For 20 years she had been one of the most powerful women in Asia, the wife of a dictator, the queen of a kleptocracy. She had travelled the world in private jets. She had met with presidents, kings and popes. She had bought mansions in New York, jewels in Paris, art in Rome. She had built a collection of over 3,000 pairs of shoes. But now it was over. Outside the palace, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos filled the streets of Manila. They were chanting, singing, demanding that she and her husband leave. The military had abandoned them. The Americans had refused to help. Imelda's husband, President Ferdinand Marcos, sat in another room, weak and dying from kidney disease. His skin was yellow from organ failure. His hands trembled. He could barely stand. He was 70 years old but looked ancient. They had hours, perhaps minutes before the palace was stormed. American helicopters were waiting on the grounds to evacuate them. But there was no time to pack properly, no time to take everything. Imelda grabbed what she could: jewelry boxes, cash, documents proving ownership of foreign properties. But she had to leave behind the shoes, thousands of them, the gowns, over 1,500 designer dresses, the art, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Canaletto, the evidence of 2 decades of looting an entire nation. By nightfall, the Marcos family was gone, flown to Hawaii in American military helicopters, abandoning the palace they had ruled from for 20 years. When Filipino soldiers and journalists entered Malacañang Palace the next day, they found something extraordinary, room after room filled with treasures that had been hidden from the Filipino people. Imelda's closet was the size of a small house. Rows and rows of designer shoes, Italian leather, French haute couture, custom-made pairs encrusted with jewels. Over 3,000 pairs. Many had never been worn. Some still had price tags attached. 1,500 designer dresses, ball gowns, cocktail dresses, everyday wear, all designer, all expensive. Drawers filled with jewelry, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, pearls, tiaras that had belonged to European royalty. In other rooms they found paintings, old masters, Renaissance art, works that belonged in museums, not in a dictator's bedroom. In the basement, crates of cash, Philippine pesos, US dollars, Swiss francs, Japanese yen, millions of dollars in physical currency, just sitting there. One photographer captured an image that would define the Marcos legacy. Rows of shoes lined up on shelves, stretching into the distance like a monument to greed. It became the symbol of everything the Marcos regime had been. Grotesque excess built on stolen wealth while millions of Filipinos lived in crushing poverty. But the shoes were just the beginning. Over the following years, investigators would discover that Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos had stolen between $5 and $10 billion from the Philippine treasury, one of the largest acts of kleptocracy in modern history. This is the story of the Marcos dynasty, a family that began with a brilliant, ruthless politician who built a career on lies and seized absolute power through deception, a family that looted an entire nation while torturing and killing anyone who resisted, and a family that astonishingly has returned to power, their crimes forgotten, their history rewritten. This is Dynasty of Greed, the Marcos family empire. To understand how Ferdinand Marcos came to power, you must first understand the Philippines in the 20th century. The Philippine Islands had been a Spanish colony for over 300 years. Spain had conquered the islands in the 1500s, converting most Filipinos to Catholicism and ruling through a corrupt colonial bureaucracy. But in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States seized the islands from Spain. The Filipinos, who had been fighting for independence from Spain, suddenly found themselves under new masters: American colonial rule. For the next 48 years, the Philippines was an American colony. The Americans built schools, roads, and a democratic system modeled on the United States. English became the official language of government and education. American culture flooded the islands, but the Philippines remained desperately poor. Most Filipinos were peasants, working land owned by a small elite, wealthy families who had prospered under Spanish and American rule. These families, the oligarchy, controlled politics, land, and wealth. They sent their children to American universities. They spoke English at home. They lived in mansions in Manila, while peasants lived in bamboo huts. On July the 4th, 1946, the Philippines became an independent nation. But independence did not bring prosperity. The economy was devastated by World War II. The government was weak and corrupt. The oligarchy continued to dominate. And into this world came a young, ambitious lawyer named Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Emmanuel Edralin. Marcos was born on September 11, 1917 in the small town of Sarat in Ilocos Norte province in northern Luzon. His father, Mariano Marcos, was a politician and school teacher. His mother, Josefa Edralin, came from a slightly wealthier family. They were not part of the elite, but they were not poor either, lower middle class, striving. Ferdinand was the second of 4 children. From childhood, he was intelligent, ambitious, and ruthless. He excelled in school. He was competitive. He needed to win, always. In 1933, at age 16, Ferdinand enrolled at the University of the Philippines to study law. He was a brilliant student, but he was also arrogant and aggressive. In 1935, while Ferdinand was in his second year of law school, something happened that would define his life. His father, Mariano, ran for a seat in the Philippine legislature. His opponent was a man named Julio Nalundasan. The election was bitter. The two men hated each other. On election day, Nalundasan won. 3 days later, on September 21st, 1935, Nalundasan was at home celebrating his victory. He was brushing his teeth in his bathroom when a single rifle shot rang out. The bullet hit him in the back. He collapsed and died. Police investigated. They found evidence suggesting the shot had been fired from the Marcos family home, which had a clear line of sight to Nalundasan's bathroom. Ferdinand, then 18 years old, was arrested and charged with murder. The trial became a sensation. A young law student accused of murdering his father's political rival. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. In 1938, Ferdinand was convicted and sentenced to prison, but Ferdinand refused to accept defeat. He appealed to the Philippine Supreme Court, and while awaiting his appeal, he did something extraordinary. He took the bar exam from prison. He passed. He scored in the top 10 in the entire country. In 1940, the Supreme Court overturned his conviction on a technicality. Whether Ferdinand actually killed Nalundasan remains unclear to this day, but the case revealed something crucial about his character. He was willing to do anything to win, and he was smart enough to escape the consequences. When World War II broke out in December 1941, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines. The invasion was swift and brutal. American and Filipino forces retreated. General Douglas MacArthur famously promised, "I shall return," as he fled to Australia. For the next 3 years, the Japanese occupied the Philippines. It was a time of horror, massacres, forced labor, starvation, torture. Many Filipinos resisted. Guerrilla fighters hid in the jungles and mountains, sabotaging Japanese operations, gathering intelligence, and waiting for the Americans to return. Ferdinand Marcos later claimed he was one of these guerrilla fighters. According to Ferdinand's own accounts, told repeatedly throughout his political career, he had been a war hero. He claimed he commanded a guerrilla unit called Ang Mga Maharlika, the Noble Ones. He claimed to have fought in numerous battles. He claimed to have killed dozens of Japanese soldiers. He claimed to have been tortured by the Japanese and escaped. After the war, Ferdinand wore military medals proudly, lots of them. He claimed to have been awarded 33 medals and decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest US military decoration. He became known as the most decorated soldier in Philippine history. His war record became the foundation of his political career. The brave guerrilla fighter who had sacrificed for his country. But it was a lie. In the 1980s, after Ferdinand had been overthrown, American and Philippine investigators examined his military records. They found that most of his medals were fake. His guerrilla unit, Angmaga Maharlika, had either never existed or had been greatly exaggerated. Many of the battles he claimed to have fought in never happened. The US Army officially stated that Ferdinand's military records had been fraudulent and absurd. Ferdinand Marcos had built his entire political career on a fabricated war record. But in the 1940s and 50s, no one questioned him. The war records were chaotic. It was easy to make claims that couldn't be verified, and Ferdinand used his fake hero status to launch a political career. In 1949, at age 31, Ferdinand was elected to the Philippine House of Representatives. He was a brilliant politician, charismatic, a gifted public speaker. He could charm anyone. He knew how to build alliances and destroy enemies. He was also utterly corrupt. From his first term, Ferdinand accepted bribes, skimmed government funds, and used his position to enrich himself. But he was careful, smart. He covered his tracks. In 1959, Ferdinand was elected to the Senate. He quickly became one of the most powerful politicians in the country. And in 1954, he met a woman who would change his life forever. Her name was Imelda Romualdez. Imelda Remedios Visitacion Trinidad. Romualdez was born on July 2, 1929 in Manila. She came from a prominent family that had fallen on hard times. Her father, Vicente Romualdez, was a lawyer, but he lost his wealth during the Great Depression and later lost his law practice. Imelda's childhood was marked by poverty and instability. The family moved frequently. Sometimes they lived in decent houses. Sometimes they were nearly homeless. But Imelda was beautiful. Strikingly, extraordinarily beautiful. She had thick black hair, high cheekbones, full lips, and a radiant smile that could light up a room. As a teenager, Imelda sang in her church choir. She had a lovely voice. She dreamed of being a star. In 1952, at age 23, Imelda entered a beauty contest in her hometown of Tacloban. She won the title Muse of Manila. She moved to Manila and worked as a salesgirl in a music store, earning a tiny salary, dreaming of a better life. In April 1954, Imelda attended a political reception. She was there as decoration, a pretty girl invited to make the event more glamorous. That night she met Congressman Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand was 36. Imelda was 24. Ferdinand was immediately captivated. Imelda was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. And he was powerful, charming, and relentless. He courted her aggressively. He sent her flowers every day. He took her to expensive dinners. He promised her a life of wealth, power, and luxury. 11 days. After they met, Ferdinand proposed marriage. Imelda said yes. On May 1st, 1954, they were married in a lavish ceremony in Manila. It was the social event of the season. Thousands of guests. A reception at the Manila Hotel. It was a marriage built on ambition. Ferdinand wanted Imelda's beauty and charm to advance his political career. Every politician needs a wife who can smile, wave, and win over voters. Imelda was perfect for that. Imelda wanted the wealth and status that Ferdinand promised. She had grown up poor. She had worked as a salesgirl. Now she would be the wife of a powerful politician. It was a transaction, and it worked. Together, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos would become the most powerful and most hated couple in Philippine history. Ferdinand's political career accelerated rapidly after his marriage. In 1959, he was elected to the Senate. He became Senate President pro tempore. He was now one of the most powerful men in Philippine politics. In 1965, Ferdinand decided to run for president. The Philippines in the 1960s was in crisis. The economy was stagnant. Corruption was endemic. Communist guerrillas, the New People's Army, were waging an insurgency in the countryside. Crime was rising. The government seemed paralyzed. Ferdinand campaigned as a reformer. He promised to fight corruption, modernize the economy, restore law and order, and make the Philippines a great nation. His slogan was, "This nation can be great again." He traveled the country giving passionate speeches. Imelda was always at his side, beautiful, smiling, singing at rallies. She became his greatest asset. And on November 9th, 1965, Ferdinand Marcos won the presidential election. On December 30th, 1965, at age 48, Ferdinand Marcos was inaugurated as the 6th president of the Philippines. Imelda became First Lady. And the looting began. Ferdinand's first term, 1965 to 1969, was marked by ambitious infrastructure projects and growing corruption. Ferdinand launched massive public works programs. He built roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals. He modernized Manila. He expanded irrigation systems. He borrowed heavily from foreign banks and international lenders to finance these projects. But behind every project was a kickback scheme. Construction contracts went to Ferdinand's friends and relatives, his cronies, in exchange for bribes. If you wanted a government contract, you paid Ferdinand 10%, 20%, sometimes more. The money went into secret bank accounts, shell companies, offshore trusts. Ferdinand also began consolidating power. He placed loyalists in key positions: the military, the police, the judiciary, government agencies. He cultivated the military especially. He increased their salaries. He gave officers perks and privileges. He promoted loyalists. He was preparing for something. Meanwhile, Imelda embraced her role as First Lady with a passion that bordered on obsession. She threw herself into cultural projects. She wanted to transform Manila into a world-class city. She wanted the Philippines to be seen as sophisticated, modern, cultured. She met with foreign leaders. She traveled constantly. New York, Paris, Rome, London. She met with presidents, kings, popes. She shopped constantly. She bought jewelry from Cartier and Bulgari, dresses from Valentino, Givenchy, and Christian Dior, shoes from Ferragamo and Manolo Blahnik. She bought art, paintings by old masters. She acquired rare violins, antique furniture. She spent money as if it were infinite. And for her, it was. She could simply take it from the government treasury. In 1969, Ferdinand ran for re-election. Under the Philippine Constitution at the time, a president could serve 2 four-year terms. Ferdinand had served 1. He was eligible for a second. But after that second term, he would be constitutionally barred from running again. His presidency would end in 1973. Ferdinand had no intention of giving up power. The 1969 election was the most violent and corrupt in Philippine history up to that point. Ferdinand spent massively, over 50 million pesos, an unprecedented amount. He bought votes, he bribed election officials, he used government resources for his campaign. His opponent was Sergio Osmeña Jr., a respected senator. On election day, there were widespread reports of fraud. Ballot boxes were stolen, voters were intimidated. Results were manipulated. Ferdinand won. But his victory came at a cost. The government was now deeply in debt, the economy was deteriorating, and public anger was growing. In the early 1970s, the Philippines was in crisis. Student protests erupted in Manila. Thousands of young people, university students, high school students, took to the streets, demanding political and economic reform, an end to corruption, and social justice. They called it the First Quarter Storm, a wave of protest in the first quarter of 1970. The protests were massive. Tens of thousands of students marched on Malacañang Palace, clashing with police. Ferdinand responded with violence. Police beat protesters, arrested them. Some were tortured. But the protests continued. Communist insurgents, the New People's Army, were growing stronger in the countryside. They were recruiting peasants, attacking police stations, and calling for revolution. Muslim separatists in the southern Philippines were also launching a rebellion, demanding independence or autonomy. The economy was collapsing. Inflation was soaring. Unemployment was rising. Ferdinand claimed the country was on the brink of chaos. And then, on August 21st, 1971, something happened that changed everything. A political rally was being held at Plaza Miranda in Manila. The Liberal Party, Ferdinand's main opposition, was holding a campaign event. All the party's leaders were on stage. Suddenly, 2 grenades were thrown into the crowd. The explosions were deafening. 9 people were killed. Over 100 were wounded. Several opposition senators were severely injured. Ferdinand immediately blamed communists. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, meaning people could be arrested and detained indefinitely without charges, but many Filipinos suspected Ferdinand himself had ordered the bombing. It was too convenient. The attack had wiped out much of the opposition leadership, and it gave Ferdinand an excuse to crack down. To this day, the truth remains unclear, but suspicion has always pointed to Ferdinand. Over the next year, Ferdinand laid the groundwork for what would come next. He cultivated the military, ensuring their loyalty. He identified potential opponents and neutralized them. He prepared legal justifications. And on September 21st, 1972, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. He went on national television and announced that the Philippines was under threat from communists, criminals, and chaos. He said strong measures were necessary to save the nation. He suspended the Constitution. He dissolved Congress. He shut down newspapers, television stations, and radio stations. He banned public assemblies. He arrested opposition politicians, journalists, student activists, and anyone suspected of opposing the regime. Thousands were imprisoned overnight. Ferdinand claimed martial law was temporary, just until order was restored. It would last 14 years. Martial law gave Ferdinand Marcos absolute power. There were no elections, no legislature, no free press, no independent judiciary. Ferdinand ruled by decree. Whatever he said became law. The military and police enforced his rule. Checkpoints appeared on roads throughout the country. Curfews were imposed. Citizens needed permits to travel between provinces. Criticism of the government became a crime. Possessing opposition literature could get you arrested. And Ferdinand used this power to crush anyone who opposed him. One of his first targets was Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. Aquino was Ferdinand's most dangerous rival. He was young, only 39 years old. He was charismatic, intelligent, and wildly popular. He came from a prominent political family. Aquino had been elected senator at age 34. Many believed he would have won the presidency in 1973 if elections had been held. On the night martial law was declared, soldiers came to Aquino's home and arrested him. Aquino was charged with subversion, murder, and illegal possession of firearms. He was tried by a military tribunal, not a civilian court, and found guilty. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. But Ferdinand never executed him. Instead, Aquino was kept in prison for 7 years, sometimes in solitary confinement, sometimes in a small cell with other prisoners. Aquino's health deteriorated. He suffered a heart attack in prison. In 1980, Ferdinand allowed him to leave the country for medical treatment in the United States. Aquino would spend the next 3 years in exile, teaching at Harvard and MIT, speaking out against the Marcos regime. But he would return, and it would cost him his life. While Ferdinand crushed political opposition, Imelda indulged in extravagance on a scale the Philippines had never seen. She traveled constantly. New York, Paris, Rome, London, Moscow, Beijing, Tripoli. She presented herself as a diplomat, Ferdinand's representative to the world. She met with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, negotiating oil deals. She met with Mao Zedong in China. She met with Soviet leaders. She met with the Pope. Everywhere she went, she shopped. She bought jewelry. In one trip to New York, she spent over $1 million on jewelry in a single afternoon. She bought clothes. Her closet at Malacañang eventually contained over 1,500 designer dresses. She bought shoes, thousands of pairs. She claimed she needed them because her feet hurt, and she had to change shoes constantly. She bought art. She commissioned Filipino artists. She bought works by European masters. She built a collection worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Where did the money come from? The Philippine Treasury? Ferdinand and Imelda treated the government budget as their personal bank account. They established foundations and charities that existed only on paper, vehicles to channel public money into private accounts. They created shell companies in tax havens, Switzerland, Hong Kong, the British Virgin Islands, Panama. They demanded kickbacks on every major government contract. If a company wanted to do business with the Philippine government, they had to pay the Marcoses 10%, 20%, sometimes more. If a foreign corporation wanted to invest in the Philippines, they had to give the Marcoses a share. If a Filipino businessman wanted a license or permit, they had to pay. The system was simple and brutal. Pay the Marcoses, or you don't do business. The money flowed into secret bank accounts around the world. Estimates vary, but investigators later concluded that Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos stole between $5 and $10 billion from the Philippine government, making Ferdinand one of history's greatest kleptocrats, alongside Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire and Suharto of Indonesia. But Imelda didn't just spend money on herself. She also embarked on a series of massive, expensive construction projects designed to glorify the Marcos regime and cement her legacy. She called it building a new society. Others called it her edifice complex. In 1969, Imelda built the Cultural Center of the Philippines, a massive complex for performing arts on Manila Bay. It cost millions and was finished in record time. She built the Folk Arts Theatre, the Philippine International Convention Center, the Coconut Palace, a guest house built entirely from coconut materials for a papal visit. She rebuilt entire sections of Manila, creating wide boulevards lined with modern buildings. But these projects were rushed, poorly planned, and often deadly. The most infamous example was the Manila Film Center. In 1981, Imelda decided the Philippines would host the first Manila International Film Festival. She wanted a world-class venue. She ordered construction of the Manila Film Center, a massive theatre on the waterfront. There was one problem. The festival was only a few months away. The building had to be completed impossibly fast. Workers laboured around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Safety was ignored. Scaffolding was inadequate. Workers were exhausted. On November 17th, 1981, at 3 o'clock in the morning, disaster struck. A massive scaffolding collapsed. Dozens of workers fell into wet, quick-setting concrete below. Some managed to crawl out. Many were trapped. Rescue efforts began immediately, but Imelda was informed of the accident and gave an order that shocked even her loyalists. Stop the rescue. Keep pouring concrete. The building must be finished on time. Workers begged to save their colleagues, but the order stood. The concrete was poured over the trapped workers. They were buried alive. The exact number of deaths was never confirmed. The government claimed fewer than 20. Survivors and witnesses said it was far more, possibly over 100, perhaps as many as 168. The bodies were never recovered. They remain entombed in the foundation of the Manila Film Center to this day. The building opened on time. Imelda attended the premiere smiling and waving for cameras. Workers claimed the building was haunted. Some refused to work there. Strange noises, cold spots, shadows. Whether ghosts exist or not, the Manila Film Center stands as a monument to Imelda's ruthlessness and the human cost of her vanity projects. While Imelda built monuments, Ferdinand's security forces terrorized the population. Martial law gave the military and police unlimited power. They could arrest anyone without a warrant, detain them indefinitely, torture them, and they did. The Philippine military established secret detention centers across the country: Camp Crame, Camp Aguinaldo, Fort Magsaysay, and dozens of smaller facilities. Political prisoners, students, activists, journalists, labor organizers, suspected communists were held in these facilities without charges, without trials, without access to lawyers or families. They were tortured. Electric shocks applied to genitals, beatings with fists, clubs, and rifle butts. Water torture, holding prisoners' heads underwater until they nearly drowned. Sexual abuse, mock executions. The torture was systematic, professional, designed to break people. Some prisoners were salvaged, a euphemism the regime used for extrajudicial execution. Their bodies were dumped in rivers, on roadsides, or in mass graves. Families would find their loved ones' bodies, sometimes intact, sometimes mutilated, left as warnings. An estimated 70,000 Filipinos were imprisoned during martial law. 34,000 were tortured. Over 3,000 were killed or disappeared. These are not abstractions. These were real people with names. Liliosa Hilao, a student activist. arrested in 1973, raped and tortured, died in custody at age 23. Archimedes Trajanu, a student, questioned Amy Marcos, Ferdinand and Imelda's daughter, about her appointment to a government position despite having no qualifications. He was abducted and tortured. His body was found days later. Boye Mijares, a journalist who had worked for Ferdinand but turned against him. He testified before the US Congress about Marcos' human rights abuses. His 16-year-old son was kidnapped in Manila, tortured, and thrown from a plane over Manila Bay. These stories multiplied, thousands of them. Amnesty International documented the abuses. Human rights organizations published reports. Survivors testified. But Ferdinand denied everything. He claimed the allegations were communist propaganda. He said martial law had brought peace and prosperity. And for a time, much of the world believed him. Why? The Cold War. The United States government supported Ferdinand Marcos because the Philippines was a crucial American ally in Southeast Asia. The US maintained two massive military bases in the Philippines, Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Base. These bases were essential to American strategy in the Pacific, allowing the US to project power against the Soviet Union and Communist China. Ferdinand knew this, and he exploited it ruthlessly. He positioned himself as a bulwark against communism. He argued that without his strong leadership, the Philippines would fall to communist insurgents. He cultivated relationships with American officials. He donated to political campaigns. He hired American lobbyists and public relations firms. And it worked. American presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, all supported Ferdinand Marcos. They provided military aid, economic assistance, and diplomatic cover. In 1969, President Nixon called Ferdinand a great friend of the United States. In 1982, President Reagan invited Ferdinand and Imelda to a state dinner at the White House. Reagan toasted Ferdinand, saying, "We stand with the Philippines. We love your adherence to democratic principles and to democratic processes." It was an obscene lie. Everyone knew the Philippines was a dictatorship, but the United States needed Ferdinand, so the lie was maintained. The support continued even as evidence of human rights abuses mounted, even as corruption became impossible to ignore, even as the Philippine economy deteriorated. The United States valued its military bases more than Filipino lives. By the early 1980s, cracks were beginning to show in the Marcos regime. The Philippine economy was collapsing. Foreign debt had exploded to over $25 billion. The government was spending more on debt payments than on education and health combined. Unemployment was rising. Inflation was soaring. The peso was losing value. Poverty was spreading. And Ferdinand's health was failing. Ferdinand was suffering from lupus, an autoimmune disease that was attacking his kidneys. By 1983, his kidneys were failing. He needed dialysis. He looked gaunt. His skin had a yellowish tinge. His hands shook. He struggled to walk. Rumors spread that he was dying. Opposition to the regime was growing, even among the elite, businessmen, church leaders, moderate politicians. There was a sense that something had to change. And in exile in the United States, Benigno Aquino was planning his return. Aquino had been living in Boston since 1980. He taught at Harvard and MIT. He gave speeches. He wrote articles criticizing the Marcos regime. But he knew he had to return to the Philippines. His presence could galvanize the opposition. He could be a symbol of resistance. His friends and family warned him. If he returned, Ferdinand would kill him. Aquino knew the risk, but he believed it was his duty. In August 1983, Aquino prepared to return. He flew from Boston to Taipei, Taiwan. From there, he would take a flight to Manila. On the plane, he told journalists traveling with him, "If they're going to kill me, they'll do it on the tarmac. I just hope they don't hit you guys." On August 21st, 1983, at 1:13 p.m., China Airlines Flight 811 landed at Manila International Airport. The plane taxied to the gate. Filipino soldiers boarded immediately. They identified Aquino and told him he had to come with them. They escorted him off the plane through a separate exit, not through the normal passenger gate. Journalists on the plane rushed to the windows. They heard a single gunshot. Seconds later, automatic gunfire erupted. When the journalists were finally allowed off the plane, they saw Aquino's body lying on the tarmac, face down, blood pooling around his head. He had been shot in the back of the head at point-blank range. Next to his body was another corpse, a man named Rolando Galman. The government immediately issued a statement. Galman, a communist assassin, had shot Aquino. Security forces had then shot and killed Galman. But the story made no sense. Aquino had been surrounded by soldiers. How did an assassin get close enough to shoot him? Witnesses, passengers on the plane, airport workers, said they saw soldiers escorting Aquino down a stairway. They heard a shot. They saw Aquino fall. It was obvious. The military had assassinated him. The assassination of Ninoy Aquino was a catastrophic mistake for Ferdinand Marcos. Aquino's funeral drew over 2 million people, the largest in Philippine history. They lined the streets of Manila for miles, weeping, chanting, "Ninoy, Ninoy." The opposition, which had been fragmented and demoralized, unified around Aquino's widow, Corazon Cory Aquino. Cory was 50 years old. She was quiet, modest, deeply religious. She had no political experience. She had been a housewife, raising 7 children while supporting her husband's career. But she became a symbol. She represented everything the Marcoses were not: humble, honest, incorruptible. She began speaking at opposition rallies. Millions came to see her. Meanwhile, the Philippine economy was in free fall. In 1984, the Philippines experienced a severe economic crisis. The peso collapsed, banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment reached 25%. The government was effectively bankrupt. It couldn't pay its debts. It couldn't pay government salaries. Ferdinand was forced to implement austerity measures dictated by the International Monetary Fund. He cut government spending. He raised taxes. But it was too late. The regime was crumbling. In November 1985, under intense pressure from the United States and facing mounting domestic unrest, Ferdinand made a desperate gamble. He announced a snap presidential election. He believed he could win. He controlled the military. He controlled the election commission. He controlled local officials who would count the votes. He could manipulate the results. He had done it before. But Cory Aquino announced she would run against him. The 1986 presidential election campaign was a spectacle. Ferdinand, weak and sick, barely campaigned. When he did appear in public, he looked terrible. He needed help walking. His speeches were short and halting. Imelda campaigned on his behalf. She travelled the country, singing at rallies, dancing, trying to project energy and glamour. But Cory Aquino drew enormous crowds. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos came to her rallies. They wore yellow, Ninoy's campaign colour. They chanted, "Cory, Cory, Cory." She spoke simply. She promised to restore democracy. She promised to fight corruption. She promised justice for her husband's murder. People believed her. On February 7th, 1986, Filipinos went to the polls. The voting was chaotic. There were widespread reports of fraud. Ballot boxes disappeared. Voters were intimidated. Results were manipulated. 2 groups counted the votes: COMELEC, the Government Election Commission, and NAM-FREL, an independent citizens watchdog group. NAM-FREL's count showed Cory winning. COMELEC's count showed Ferdinand winning. The official COMELEC count declared Ferdinand the winner. But no one believed it. International observers called the election fraudulent. The Catholic Church condemned the results. The country was on the brink of explosion. On February 15th, Cory Aquino called for a campaign of civil disobedience. She urged Filipinos to boycott businesses owned by Marcos cronies, to refuse to pay taxes to the regime, to engage in peaceful resistance. Across the country, people responded. They withdrew money from banks owned by Marcos allies. They stopped buying products from Marcos-connected companies. The economy, already fragile, began to collapse. And then, on February 22nd, 1986, everything changed. 2 of Ferdinand's most senior military officers, Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and Lieutenant General Fidel Ramos, the Deputy Chief of Staff, held a press conference. They announced they were withdrawing their support from President Marcos. They said the election had been stolen. They called on Ferdinand to step down. They barricaded themselves in 2 military camps in Manila, Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Cram, and prepared for a siege. Ferdinand was furious. He ordered loyal military units to arrest Enrile and Ramos. Tanks and troops began moving toward the camps. But then something extraordinary happened. Jaime Cardinal Sin, the Archbishop of Manila, went on the radio. He called on Filipinos to go to the military camps and protect the defectors. Go to Camp Creme and Camp Aguinaldo, he said. Bring food. Pray. Form human barricades. Within hours, thousands of people poured into the streets. They formed human chains around the camps. By the next morning, February 23rd, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos filled Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, the main highway running through Manila. They called it EDSA. The crowd grew throughout the day. By evening, over 1 million people filled the avenue. They brought food and water for the soldiers. They sang, they prayed. Catholic nuns knelt in front of tanks, offering flowers to soldiers. Ferdinand ordered the military to clear the streets, to fire on the crowds if necessary. But the soldiers refused. Tank crews abandoned their vehicles. Helicopter pilots defected, flying their aircraft to the rebel camps. Entire military units switched sides. By February 24th, Ferdinand's government had effectively collapsed. Most of the military had defected. The palace was surrounded. Ferdinand called the American embassy, begging for support. He spoke to Senator Paul Laxalt, a close friend of President Reagan and Reagan's personal envoy. What should I do? Ferdinand asked. Laxalt replied, I think you should cut, and cut cleanly. The time has come. Ferdinand realized it was over. On the morning of February 25th, 1986, Ferdinand made a final desperate move. He held a hasty inauguration ceremony at Malacanang Palace, swearing himself in for another term. But at the same moment, just a few miles away, Cory Aquino was being sworn in as president by a Supreme Court justice, with hundreds of thousands of Filipinos celebrating in the streets. There were now 2 presidents, but only one had the support of the people and the military. That afternoon, Ferdinand called the U.S. embassy again. He asked for asylum. American helicopters landed at Malacanang Palace. Ferdinand, Imelda, their children, and a few dozen loyalists boarded. As the helicopters lifted off, Imelda wept. Ferdinand stared silently out the window. They were flown to Clark Air Base, then transferred to a U.S. Air Force plane that flew them to Hawaii. As the plane crossed the Pacific, the Marcos era ended. When Filipino soldiers, journalists, and ordinary citizens entered Malacanang Palace, they couldn't believe what they found. Imelda's closet was enormous, the size of a small house, rows and rows of designer shoes, over 3,000 pairs, Italian leather, French designers, custom-made shoes encrusted with jewels. Many had never been worn. 1,500 dresses, ball gowns, cocktail dresses, all designer, all expensive. Some still had price tags attached, jewelry boxes filled with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, pearls, tiaras, necklaces worth millions. In other rooms they found paintings. Michelangelo, Botticelli, Canaletto, Renaissance masters, art that belonged in museums. In Ferdinand's office they found documents, bank records, property deeds, incorporation papers for shell companies in Switzerland, Hong Kong, Panama. In the basement, crates of cash, Philippine pesos, US dollars, Swiss francs, millions of dollars in physical currency. One room contained Imelda's collection of bras, hundreds of them, custom-made. Another room was filled with unopened boxes of luxury goods, china, silverware, crystal. The palace was a museum of greed. Photographers documented everything. The images were broadcast around the world. The shoes especially became iconic. They symbolized everything wrong with the Marcos regime. Grotesque excess while millions lived in poverty. Over the following months and years, Philippine investigators working with authorities in the United States, Switzerland, and other countries began tracing the Marcos wealth. They found bank accounts in Switzerland containing hundreds of millions of dollars, real estate in New York, including 4 buildings on prime Manhattan property, including the Crown Building on Fifth Avenue, art collections scattered across the world, jewelry hidden in safe deposit boxes. The Philippine government filed hundreds of lawsuits to recover the stolen assets. It would take decades. Many cases are still ongoing, and the Marcos family has fought every step of the way, delaying, appealing, hiding assets. But investigators eventually concluded that Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos stole between $5 and $10 billion from the Philippine people. $5 to $10 billion. To put that in perspective, in the 1980s, the Philippines' annual national budget was around $5 billion. The Marcoses stole the equivalent of 1 to 2 years of the entire national budget. Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos spent the last years of Ferdinand's life in exile in Honolulu, Hawaii. They lived in a modest house by their standards in the Makiki Heights neighborhood, provided by a wealthy Filipino-American supporter. Ferdinand was dying. His lupus had destroyed his kidneys. He needed dialysis 3 times a week. His body was failing, but he refused to admit defeat. He gave interviews to journalists, claiming he was still the legitimate president of the Philippines. He said he would return and reclaim power. The US government allowed the Marcoses to stay in Hawaii, but they watched them closely. The FBI investigated their finances. Their bank accounts were frozen. They were essentially prisoners. Imelda tried to maintain appearances. She wore her jewelry. She entertained visitors. She insisted she had done nothing wrong. But the reality was inescapable. They had been overthrown. They were in exile. They would never return to power. On September 28, 1989, Ferdinand Marcos died of heart, lung, and kidney failure. He was 72 years old. Imelda wanted to bring his body back to the Philippines for a hero's burial. President Cory Aquino refused. She said Ferdinand could be buried in the Philippines, but not in the National Heroes Cemetery, and not with state honors. Imelda refused those terms. Ferdinand's body was embalmed and placed in a refrigerated crypt in Hawaii, where it would remain for 27 years. After Ferdinand's death, Imelda became obsessed with 2 things: returning to the Philippines and rehabilitating the Marcos name. In 1991, President Cory Aquino, under pressure and perhaps believing Imelda was no longer a threat, allowed her to return to the Philippines. Imelda landed in Manila and was immediately arrested. She was charged with corruption, embezzlement, and violating foreign exchange laws, but she was released on bail. Over the following decades, Imelda faced multiple trials. She was convicted in some cases, acquitted in others. She appealed every conviction. She used every legal maneuver to delay. She never spent a day in prison. And she began a campaign to rewrite history. Imelda gave interviews. She appeared on television. She wrote books. She claimed that she and Ferdinand had been heroes who modernized the Philippines. That martial law was necessary to save the country from communism. That the corruption charges were lies invented by their enemies. She portrayed herself as a victim, a widow unfairly persecuted. And astonishingly, some Filipinos began to believe her. Ferdinand and Imelda had 3 children: Amy, Ferdinand, Bongbong Jr., and Irene. All 3 had lived lives of privilege and excess during their parents' rule. After the fall, Amy and Bongbong entered politics. Amy was elected governor of Ilocos Norte, the Marcos family's home province, in 1998. She portrayed herself as a competent administrator, distancing herself from her parents' crimes while benefiting from the family name. In 2016, she was elected to the Senate. Bongbong, Ferdinand Jr., was more ambitious. He served as congressman, then governor of Ilocos Norte, then senator. In 2016, he ran for vice president. He lost narrowly to Leni Robredo in a contested election. He claimed fraud, but couldn't prove it. The Marcos children rebuilt the family's political power slowly and carefully. They never apologized for martial law. They never acknowledged the torture, the murders, the stolen billions. Instead, They claimed their parents had been misunderstood, vilified by biased media, victims of political persecution. And they found a powerful new tool: social media. In the 2010s, the Marcos family embraced Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and later TikTok. They hired teams of social media managers, content creators, and online influencers. They flooded the internet with pro-Marcos content, videos showing Ferdinand as a strong leader, Imelda as an elegant first lady. Martial law as an era of peace and prosperity. The golden age. They posted false information, fake news articles claiming the Marcoses were innocent, conspiracy theories blaming the Aquinos and other enemies, distorted statistics claiming the economy was better under Ferdinand than under any other president. They attacked critics. Anyone who spoke negatively about the Marcoses was targeted. Trolls flooded their social media with insults and threats. And it worked. A new generation of Filipinos, many too young to remember martial law, saw the Marcos name not as a symbol of dictatorship and theft, but as a brand associated with strength, order, and national pride. By 2020, polls showed that a majority of young Filipinos had a favorable view of Ferdinand Marcos. Many believed martial law was good for the Philippines. The Marcos family had successfully rewritten history. In May 2022, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. announced he was running for president. His running mate was Sara Duterte, daughter of the outgoing president Rodrigo Duterte, himself a controversial strongman accused of human rights abuses. Bongbong's campaign was brilliantly simple. Nostalgia. He promised to bring back the golden age of his father's rule. He promised unity and prosperity. He avoided specifics. He gave few interviews. He refused to debate opponents. But his social media machine was relentless. TikTok videos, Facebook memes, YouTube documentaries, all portraying the Marcos family as victims and heroes. His main opponent was Leni Robredo, the sitting vice president, a lawyer and human rights advocate. Robredo campaigned on good governance, transparency, and accountability. She spoke about the Marcos family's crimes. She reminded people of martial law. But she couldn't compete with the Marcos social media machine. On May 9th, 2022, Filipinos went to the polls. Bongbong Marcos won in a landslide. He received over 31 million votes, nearly 60%. It was the largest margin of victory in Philippine presidential history. On June 30th, 2022, 36 years after his father was overthrown and fled into exile, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. was sworn in as the 17th president of the Philippines. Imelda Marcos, now 93 years old, attended the inauguration. She wore a traditional Filipino gown and smiled for cameras. The Marcos family had returned to power. In 2023, President Bongbong Marcos ordered that his father's body, which had been lying in a refrigerated crypt in Ilocos Norte since being returned from Hawaii in 1993, be moved. Ferdinand Marcos was buried in the Libingan ng mga Bayani, the heroes' cemetery in Manila, with full military honours. It was a final insult to martial law victims. Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator who had stolen billions and killed thousands, was buried as a hero. Human rights groups protested. Survivors of torture wept. Families of the disappeared cried out in anguish. But the Marcos family had won. Today, the Marcos family remains one of the most powerful political dynasties in the Philippines. Imelda is in her mid-90s, still living in Manila. She still wears designer clothes. She still gives interviews, defending her husband and claiming they were heroes. Bongbong is president. His sister Amy is a senator. The family controls vast wealth, though the full extent is hidden in shell companies and offshore accounts, and the historical revisionism continues. On TikTok, millions of young Filipinos consume videos portraying the Marcos era as a golden age. Videos with dramatic music and old photos showing infrastructure projects, cultural events, and Imelda meeting world leaders. The torture is never mentioned. The murders are erased. The stolen billions are dismissed as propaganda. Critics are attacked. Martial law survivors who speak out are called liars or paid trolls. The Marcos family has successfully rewritten history in the minds of millions. But the victims remember. An estimated 70,000 people were imprisoned during martial law, 34,000 were tortured, over 3,000 were killed or disappeared. These are not abstractions. These were real people. Students, workers, journalists, activists, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. They were beaten, electrocuted, raped, murdered, and their families have never received justice. The billions stolen by the Marcoses have never been fully recovered. Money that could have built schools, hospitals, roads. Money that could have lifted millions out of poverty. Instead, it sits in secret bank accounts. It bought mansions and jewels and shoes. The Philippines today remains one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. Corruption is endemic, democratic institutions are fragile, and the family responsible for much of this suffering is back in power. The story of the Marcos dynasty is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present and the future. It is a warning about how democracy can be destroyed, how kleptocrats can loot nations, how torture and murder can be rebranded as law and order. And it is a warning about how history can be erased, because the greatest crime of the Marcos family is not just what they stole. It is what they have stolen from memory. They have stolen truth. They have stolen justice. They have stolen the right of victims to be believed. And they have done it with smiles and songs and 3,000 pairs of shoes. Ferdinand Marcos died in exile, disgraced, but his family has returned victorious. And the shoes remain in a museum in Manila, rows and rows of them, gathering dust, symbols of greed that no one seems to remember. This has been Dynasty of Greed, the Marcos family empire. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.